So what I took from the theme of the conference, it was a provocation for us to reflect on how did we get here? How did we get here in terms of thinking about how do we understand dynamics in socio-ecological systems? So what I'm going to hope to do here is to step back and look at the great acceleration from a different perspective. We tend to look, and Gary did a fantastic job in unpacking the political economy of the great acceleration. And I'll do a different job here, which is to unpack the challenge of the great acceleration for us who come from disciplines, and what it represents for us as a reality check of how limited we are with our tools to capture a world in very fast acceleration, but with a long history of past dependency. And that's the reflection that I want to do, and is, in fact, starting at the onset. You know, I want you to try to step back in thinking about what we're trying to do today, 65 years ago. And whether you can actually put the challenge in your head that some of the same challenges that we face today were similar to the challenge we faced 65 years ago, or it was worse even. You know, I want to do that because, well, for several reasons, personal reasons, and I think to some extent disciplinary reason, to see how the discipline has evolved in trying to understand that, and the setbacks that we had, and the advances that we had, and what can we learn from that process. And I think to move forward, we need to step back in history and see the parallels that many of the challenges that we have today, we've been trying to do it for 5 years or much longer. And I'll try to make that case. And to repeat, I think it's a critical moment to deeply reflect on those challenges. And Gary already did that towards the end of the presentation. In fact, the end of our presentations converge in an interesting way. I'll do so with a little disciplinary bias by looking at the history that anthropology has helped to contribute to the process of understanding socio-ecological change. There are many efforts during the first half of the 20th century in human ecology and social ecology that have tried to address these kinds of issues. And I'll get an entry point to the effort of cultural ecology. And in part because I would argue, and maybe not even familiar to most of you, but I would argue has been perhaps the most influential school and approach to understand those things, or at least pave and provide the foundations to understand what we have today. So imagine Julian Stewart. He comes from the American School of Anthropology. From the 30s and 50s, he was trying to grasp with the question of human-environment interaction. What we had at that time was a debate between what is a long history of environmental determinism and what was emerging as the historical possibilism, or if you could think, a cultural determinism. So you had this two schools of thoughts trying to interpret why people are diverse in the world. In what ways the environment shaped cultural diversity? In what ways the environment allows cultural complexity to emerge? Those are the kinds of questions that people were asking at that time. And from one side, you had the environmental determinists, which still persist today in many of our narratives. And on the other side, you have the cultural determinists. What Stewart was trying to do at the time was to confront that and the other approaches that were there. So when you read in the title, A Methodology of Multilinear Evolution, what he was trying to do is to confront the idea of unilinear evolution that dominated at the time. And it still dominates many of our things today when we think about the way we think about development. Developing, developed, overdeveloped, whatever way you can think about. But he was trying to confront that with the idea that there are many pathways in which human-environment interactions will take society forward. And he proposed this multilinear approach that freed, to some extent, at the time, the dominant socio-evolutionary models that explain change in societies with an European reference. He was also trying to confront the dominant cultural taxonomies and racial taxonomies that were related to interpreting the impact and the interactions between human and environment. And what he did was to propose a very explicit empirical methodology. And it's an empirical methodology that you're going to see, I hope, many elements that are very similar to what we call social-ecological systems today. What he was hoping was not a general theory of culture, not a general model to interpret culture everywhere, but a method that you could go to the field and study how a particular localized phenomena would develop. And his method had these three components. On the one side, he had, the most important one, environmental constraints. And I just listed a few things there, but the key idea there is that you have limiting factors. And on the other hand, he said you need to pick what he called the culture core, the key elements in social organization that are part of an adaptation to the limitations that the environment offers. And in between this process, you have to understand the technology, how technology mediates those two things. I'm actually not being fair to Stewart, of course, because it's a very developed and a very quick way to discuss a very developed argument. But he set forward one of the most productive periods and prolific periods of research on understanding cultural human-environment interactions in many different societies in many different contexts. And it was the seeds to understand adaptation. What he poses that culture change is the creative process of adapting to the environmental limitations that you have. And that set forward, as I said, a very productive school that shaped what we do today, if we recognize it or not. There's a component, and I'll try to make that bridge there, there's a component to the cultural ecology approach that he called levels of social integration. Because he worked with the Plain Indians in the American West, very small band societies in general, very small scale. But he knew that to understand and to fulfill his approach, you have to understand how those social units and those interactions with the environment would relate to larger and complex systems. And he put that in practice in a project that was a very important project, again, forgotten project, called the Peoples of Puerto Rico. And the Peoples of Puerto Rico is developed a strategy that we actually do a lot today. It was a team, I believe, of 5, mostly anthropologists, distributed in different places of Puerto Rico, trying to understand those adaptations under a common framework and try to come together to talk about that complex society. That is the approach to understand levels of social integration of Stewart and many others that I don't have time to do between the 50s and the 70s. I would say is the big forgotten project of the social science. For many reasons. All the initiatives to understand complexity got arrested in the 60s and 70s because of a series of debates, and led to a level of specialization and pulverization, some would say, that contribute to a lot of what we know today, but also led some missing links to put together the pieces. And now, there are 2 books here that you start to see a different perspective that start to come from the Peoples of Puerto Rico project, Workers in the Cane and Peasant Wars. And I'll come back to that when I talk about political ecology that emerged from this. So when you look at what happened at that time, Stewart set forth this, and in the 60s already, there was a major reaction, mostly within anthropology, from a group that was saying, what we need to do now is to engage with ecosystem ecology. Ecosystem was emerging, ecosystem ecology was emerging, system theory was emerging at the time, and they were saying that Stewart's model was not able to capture the full dynamics and feedbacks that you have between human and environment interactions. And what is called an ecosystem approach start to emerge under the rubric of that we call ecological anthropology. So influenced by Odum, as I said, we anthropologists were doing models very similar than we're doing today. It's the beginning of also the computational system approach. So, and you have an emphasis here on feedback mechanisms, what we think about adaptation today, and the process in which energy and information and materials circulates in ecosystems, and in that process of adjustments and adaptation that are part of that interaction. I'm going to go very fast to this, but just to give you an idea. At that same time, that brand became so-called the new functionalist, the reductionist, the obsessed with energy, because of the models were focused on that. And what was coming, and here we are back to Eric Wolf, Sidney Mintz, and others, were working in colonial societies. And what they're seeing is that what we're observing is not the process of the limits that the environment puts on the societal adjustment. We're observing a process of colonialism. And what we need to look at is how world systems and the global mercantile system actually shape those connections. And cultural ecology start to emerge. The term actually comes much earlier than that. But Eric Wolf, in a '72 paper called Ownership and Political Ecology, sets that new line of research that we know very well today, and we depend very much today, where we understand and we look at that relationship by not forgetting ownership and control, power relations, access and tenure, and all the systems that shape the way local environment and people interactions go. Parallel to that, you have another approach, looking and asking for other questions. And here I'm putting ethnobiology, but you go back to the 19th century ethnobotany and then ethnoecology and a bunch of ethnoscience at the time. We're looking into people's mind and forms of understanding the environment. And it coincides with a period where structuralism was emerging, sensorial linguistics were emerging, and trying to understand whether do we have universal systems of classification or not? But how do we think about, how do we cognize the environment? How do we make distinctions? How do we organize life forms in our minds, and how that influence the way we interact with the environment? And the story goes, and little later, there was another missing piece, which came with historical ecology. The 80s and 90s saw that different movement that, there was a very contested time between ecosystem, ecological anthropology and political ecology, sort of one of those intellectual wars that we wish we never had. And historical ecology was bringing a different perspective. First, forget about limiting factors. Human agency changed the environment the way we want. And so the limiting factor is not an approach that we need to understand. What we need to understand is actually our ability to change. We need to look at much larger scales, much longer time frames, and basically think about the environment as an anthropogenic environment. So I was curious when I saw the map today that I saw the wild map, the Amazon as a wild land. And one of the key articles in '89 that shaped this field by Bill Ballet was called The Culture of Amazonian Forests. In one article, he makes the case that a good chunk of the Amazon is anthropogenic and tells the history of that. So historical ecology brought that other piece. And just to make move past the story, you have that other part starting to emerge, which is confronting what has structured most of these other developments, which is the so-called culture-nature dichotomy. Put the environment here, you put society here, and you try to understand that as species interacting. But symbolic ecology was trying to do more than that. It was trying really to rethink that the way we look at the environment from a Western perspective is one but many ways that conceptualize the world and the universe, in fact, in very different perspectives. And was questioning every one of the other fields, including ethnobiology, that was using Linnean taxonomy as the basis to understand local knowledge and trying to fit that taxonomy, asking the question, whether do we all have that universal way of thinking? So it played a very important role in bringing this other perspective. To make a long history short, we have an immense evolution of this field that is done by ruptures, or by looking at each time at a different variable. Now, that positions, and that's another discussion, but that positions anthropology in a very particular way today as both central to bring all the species to the table of our discussion here, but also marginal to it. As we have those different pieces, but we do not have a synthesis. We haven't put them together as we could put them together. And it has been a process of very painful debates, which I'm kind of not going into very much here. But it's a process that you see all those things. You see specializations, you see advances in understanding, you see ruptures. You see a lot of overlaps and synergies as they evolve, and I'll try to show with brief examples of my own work. But Eric Wolf said, in reflecting in the legacy of Roy Rappaport, which I skip in talking about, this one of the most fascinating studies of the time, Pigs for the Ancestors in 1968, he said, this has also been a project of intellectual deforestation. And what he meant by that was that for every new approach that came, for every new variable that we brought forward, we tried to do so by denying everything that was before, by really erasing what we have learned on those other approaches and contesting it in one way or another as invalid. And that's a legacy that we need to have in mind today as we go through the Anthropocene debate, which I'll try to make that parallel here. But as I said, we got the components, but not the synthesis. And that I'm speaking from the perspective of anthropology. So, just very briefly looking, because I want to go back, and I'm lost in time here, to be honest. And make a case for the importance of longitudinal research. And I've been working many sites in the Amazon for about over 25 years. In one of the sites, I've been continuously working for all this time every year. And what you see there is that I'm putting a short list of what we have seen over time when you follow two generations, when you see kids that you saw being born, having their own kids today, and what they're thinking about that process. But you also see all the initiatives that have come through and passed and left, and sometimes left more pain than success. We see lots of liberation theology trying to reclaim, to reframe community as a unit of organization. We see many sustainable development projects in the 90s coming and go and leaving scars that are worse than when they arrived. We see the intensification of market networks and now conditional cash transfer programs and a number of other things. What I'm saying here is that I basically needed all those tools to understand that. They each contribute to a particular kind of questions to understand all these changes in a region that is so important, of course, in itself, but elsewhere. So cultural ecology, and I was trained in the tradition of cultural ecology beginning, was a very natural point of start. You know, the water dictates life in this region. The environment, there's a limiting factor in which the organized time, organizes everything in life. And cultural ecology helped me to understand that interaction and how that has shaped history in the process, organization, and environment in this area. But this is the area with the longest colonial legacy in the Amazon. So beyond that environmental limiting factor or determinism, if you will, you have the legacy of absentee ownership, of land tenure, of actually owning people, When I arrived there, one of my first experiences was to talk to a family, and the mother was sort of crying. They were like in the 70s and 80s, the third generation sharecroppers that were about to be expelled because the son of the old owner had taken over the farm or the area. And that, you know, gave a sense of the power and the role of those forces in actually shaping what people do. And time goes, and the ethnobiologists start to help to review what is that environment that we call wild sometimes, but what is there that the people are shaping it, people are understanding, people are manipulating and making a living out of it. And when you look very closely, you start to unpack both the sophistication of knowledge that goes into the process, but also reflect on our own classification of how do we look into what is productive land, what are productive systems, what is intensification, and question our criteria to look into that. The symbolic aspect of, and I'll say the acai palm, you'll see why, of having key resources that are sort of the catalyst of social life in a region. It's also a time of acceleration. The Amazon is an emblematic of this global great acceleration. And to confront that, those tools are also limited. And you start to see, and here's a connection that I'll perhaps make later with one earlier version of this community, the land use, land cover change community, which is now the Global Land Project, and how they start to help me rethink, to put together some of those pieces and tools to start to understand a region that's becoming more and more complex in many ways. And thinking about the political ecology of those tools. And here, very briefly, you know, how we think about the people, and here, one of the key elements there is this category, the social category of extractivists, which comes from the history of extractivists in the Amazon. And the people that I work are called extractivists. And when I studied their production systems, as I show you in a minute, what I discovered, if I took all those other layers or my glasses of understanding it in particular ways, what I saw is some of the most intensive production systems. And I started to think, they are not extractivists, they're farmers, and they're forest farmers. And that is a product of how we see that social, or how do we put a social category for a number of reasons. So, using an image, and here on the left you have just a plain image without any classification, where if you look at that agroforest system that I show, you put that as a native forest, and therefore people as passive, the extractors. If you really map that as an intensive category, suddenly you have the most important land use in the region. And their position in the region changed completely from a passive actor that benefits from things, from the main economic agents in a region. There's a lot to be said about social categories. And they enter into a global market. And what became really interesting for me was that my ethnographic approach, and I worked mostly with households in local communities, was not enough. They are going to a global market very fast. My ethnography became a commodity chain ethnography. I start to move with them in boats and going to the markets and spending more time in the market than spending in the communities. But having as a reference, how are they being part of that project? I'm going to speed up because of time here. And then you start to unpack why some places continue to be underdeveloped when you have this billion-dollar economy running through their hands. And how the process of value aggregation and the political economy of value aggregation maintain that hierarchy of social hierarchy, even when you have the most successful economy and wide participation as you could imagine, and sustainable from an environmental point of view. Again, I don't have time to go into this a lot, but you got the idea. And more I've been working into cities, because the households that I've been working are in between the two, negotiating those two spaces, and again, is a different kind of methodology shift that we take. And our current project is a Belmont Forum project based on collaboration, and we're trying now to engage at a delta level and a delta system that requires a different kind of complexity, and trying to bring those conceptual frameworks now to deal with a multi-level complexity, but without losing the touch with the local condition. That is what interests me, at least. So again, in each one of those things I could talk about an hour, I guess. But let's go back to Anthropocene and start closing this, and hopefully, making that parallel that I started at the beginning of the lessons that we see in the evolution of this process. The Anthropocene has mobilized more than anything, and Gary did a great job on that, not only their system science community, but broadly, from artists to the humanities to the social science, and mobilized in different ways. And we are right now at the apex of that debate. And that's why I'm saying it's a very critical moment that we reflect on where that's going. And that's a citation index of peer-reviewed literature, so you see how fast the term really picked up and mobilized. And that's why it becomes very important. It mobilizes a community that can be brought into that debate, but with the history in mind of previous, anyhow. Now, when when you start to be in a hurry, what I think is interesting is that of the way globalization in the 80s, at least for anthropology, but whatever, brought cold water in your face. How do you deal with this? And there are two things that I want to call attention here. The biggest advance that we had was the rise of conceptual frameworks. And conceptual frameworks start to emerge at that meeting place where we could bring our pieces into a larger picture and try to put things together and collaborate, share a language, share an interest, and see the value of our specialties within a larger question. This is a random, by the way, not that random, but almost random selection there. I don't want to make any point with the selection there. But it helped us to have that meta-theoretical tool to break interdisciplinary, to break dichotomies, and to sort of slowly, progressively move to an understanding of complexity. It has been much more harder to deal with the scale and connectivity. And speaking for the social science, well, the way we have dealt with it since the 80s was through a combination of narrative devices and analytical tools that do a great job at one point, and then we get stuck on their limitations and their analytical limitations. And here are just a few examples of narrative devices that have been very useful, and yet, not all of them, yet they get us so far in dealing with that left behind project of understanding complexity, at least from the social science perspective. Now, the crux of the Anthropocene debate are the tensions that it brings. And that's where we need to put our eyes on, and that's, I think, it's where we need to work through. If we ignore those tensions, we're setting ourselves for another bifurcation, or several other bifurcations. And Gary did a great job on that, I think, already, and sort of saved my time here in pointing to some of those things. So, some of the first reactions that you see in the literature are the reactions of, here you have the Earth system science, human species interpretation of the Anthropocene. And that ignores the history of political economy of the Anthropocene. And ignores the history of inequality that has created the whole problem that we live today. And here are many versions of the kinds of debates that you see in the literature that are touching into the tension that we have. And perhaps that's why I did this talk the way I did today, because a lot of that is really touching me and bothering me, in part because of the way I think about the history in which that I showed you in anthropology. The history of intellectual deforestation that in some cases dominated that. And part of that history has to do with that. It's better to criticize and to confront than to engage in trying to see the complementarity in our limitations. And that is an issue that we need to reflect, not in moving forward as separate communities, thinking that we're dealing with those things, but understanding that these are the challenges that actually are behind our conceptual frameworks. And the really big challenge that we need to think very differently, as Gary pointed out before, I think very well. And I'm seeing another version of cultural ecology here, at a very different level. Environmental constraints on the one side, planetary boundaries in that case, a culture core on the other side, the SDGs on the other. That's fine. I mean, that puts, I mean, it in part means that we've been dealing with that same, struggling with that same problem all the time. The question is, can we put in the middle all those points of tension that we are confronting today? So, can we bring complexity, interdependence, connectivity to understand, you know, complexity in political economy, complexity in human behavior, narratives, and values, or not? I mean, I'm putting that as a question to myself. You know, can we bring this new cultural ecology without the legacies or without the problems that we had in when we first set up, or when Stewart first set up to provide a way of working towards that problem? So again, questions to myself. Are we moving to other kinds of specializations or disciplinary speciations with other names? Are we reviving a process of intellectual deforestation? And some papers that I've read kind of propose that. I'm not going to cite here, of course. Or can we move to new synthesis? And what kind of new synthesis? And I don't have an answer here. But I mean, those are the questions that we have to confront. And those are questions, you know, about human behavior in other ways, about our behavior as scholars, as practitioners, as actors in the systems. And it's a problem of humility. And that's a problem that in academia we have a lot of problem with. We have enormous problems with disciplinary territories. And our institutions are so slow to move that they help you with that. It's very hard to change those things from the inside. And our communities like that help to push us and to frame new questions for our own disciplines or for our own approaches so we move to new ways of thinking. And that's my conclusion. I'll let you read those 2 points that I think kind of express, and I think, I guess, converging again with Gary. At least a humble way of moving forward. Thank you.